we have the right creedal, like you said, foundation, we will love the real Jesus.
Yeah.
Not some artificial one.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining me on the Unrefined Podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Spain, along with Lindsay Waters, where each week we delve into the mysteries that shape our world, from the tangible to the supernatural, with a foundation rooted in biblical truth. For more content and exclusive resources, visit us at unrefinedpodcast.com. Now, let's dive into this week's episode. Hey, you guys. Some guests crack open dusty tombs, others live in them. Today's guest is one of the few scholars who can navigate both ancient texts and modern heresies without losing the plot or the gospel. Whether he's breaking down biblical giants, unmasking old gods, or schooling us on first-century worldviews, this man always brings the receipts. He is no stranger to the Unrefined Podcast, and he's back to help us dismantle a particularly persistent distortion, one that slithers to the margins of theology with Gnostic whispers and racialized lies. So let's call it what it is and bring in the expert. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Burton. Glad to have you here.
Thank you. Glad to be back.
Yeah, we're definitely glad for you to be back. And this is kind of a little background of why we want to have you on the show about this. Is I kind of ask you questions about stuff if I get a chance, if you're not busy, here and there. And this is just something I'm seeing everywhere in our I like liminal better than fringe, but fringe works in our fringe circles of liminality. How about that? And there's this doctrine that we're about to talk about, and then there's several others. I have a theory of why all that happens, but I'm not here to talk. We're here to listen to you. Let's just start with what I wanted to talk to you about, and then we can, if we want to dive into anything else, we can go there too, and just see where the spirit wants to go. So does that sound all right with you?
Sounds good.
Okay, cool. So let's just basic question for those who might not have heard of it or have heard of it and not know what it's called. What exactly is the, quote, serpent seed doctrine, and where did it originate?
Well, and you're right to point out that this stuff just keeps popping up in this space all over the place. When I think that it's maybe finally died down in its popularity or notoriety, whichever you want to use, it just seems to pop right back up. But the serpent seed doctrine, in essence, is an interpretation, a flawed hermeneutic on the Genesis 3:15 prophecy about, and again, most students of the Bible will be familiar with that passage where it talks about the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, seed of the
Genesis 3:15, right?
That's right, Genesis 3:15. Well, before we get into some of the deep waters, it's just a prophecy that lays out the war, the very real war that goes on between the followers of the serpent or the devil and the followers of Christ, the seed of the woman. And there's the phrase about the crushing of the head of the serpent will bruise the heel of the seed of the woman, and the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. This, of course, is a reference to the Messiah, to Jesus.
Yeah. And
by proxy, his followers. But the serpent seed doctrine basically takes this entire passage, particularly a couple of verses before in verse 13, where it talks about the serpent deceiving Eve. Again, this is a story that all of us know from Sunday school, right? The temptation of Eve, the eating of the fruit from the tree that was forbidden in the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the beguilement there, the deception, as we'll see as we go through our discussion today, is a moral philosophical conundrum. It has nothing to do with what serpent seed doctrine proponents would say, that the act here, the beguilement, was a sexual seduction, and that there was an actual sexual act between the serpent, the Nakash, and Eve, and the production of that, the result of that was Cain. And it would be Cain's physical descendants that were the wicked progeny, if you will, that would war against the the seed of the woman, and that being Adam and Seth. What you're looking at here is basically the linguistic equivalent of pareidolia.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
The word there for beguilement in Hebrew is nashah, and it again the whole precedent there is set up very well by the author, that it's a question of knowledge. It's a question of awareness. It's not a question of carnal activity.
Mm.
And again, I am one scholar in a long line of scholars who have written and talked about this. I myself have not written about it, but I became acquainted with the serpent seed doctrine when I got into this liminal space, as you call it. I think quite accurately. But the bottom line is that it's and if people don't know what pareidolia is, this is when you look at a pattern in, it doesn't have to be in nature, but it's very often in nature, and then you construct a false interpretation based on weak philosophical premises. And so an example of this would be simply because the human mind is designed really to look for patterns. But an example of this would be like Devil's Tower. There's a lot of discussion about this being an ancient petrified tree stump based on an erroneous interpretation of the Book of Enoch. And if people want to look more into that, they can look at the work of George Nicholsburg, who's basically solved a lot of those misinterpretations. At any rate, there are a lot of people who say that Devil's Tower is one of these, primeval tree stumps from before the flood, simply because it looks like
tree stump.
It could be a tree stump, but it's a magma extrusion. This has been thoroughly drummed out by the extensive geological work that's been done on that particular feature. So that's an example of pareidolia. And you're looking at a kind of linguistic version of that when people either subscribe to, and certainly in the developmental stages of the serpent seed doctrine, you're looking at a case of what I would call linguistic pareidolia.
Judd, is this kind of related to the whole idea of knowing versus, I forget the two Spanish terms I've learned in school, but you know what I'm talking about, is knowing with your mind as opposed to like an intimate knowing? Are they playing on the kind of the subtlety between of that word there a little bit? Or
well, the Spanish word for to know is there are two words, and most of the words for knowledge stem from the Latin roots and Greek roots by proxy. There's a Spanish word conozco, but there's also comprendo and entiendo. There are a number of words that you could use for I know in Spanish, but they largely, again, the Romance language words for knowledge, I know, you're going to find some variation on the Greek gnosko, which is where So, and the knowledge, again, the knowledge from the passage in Genesis, of course, we're talking about Hebrew here, not Romance languages, but it's very clear from the passage, and even the word there, beguilement, the shah that's used is again, it just nuts and bolts philosophical terms. It's a moral issue. It's a knowledge-based deception. It's not a fleshly, carnal sort of thing. And that's, again, if you torture the words enough, they'll admit to anything. But most of that stems from either no language training or bad language training or insufficient language training, and that's where you get a lot of. I mean, clearly, people that espouse this are interested in the Bible. But this doctrine in particular illustrates one of the things that I talk about routinely, and that is the difference between interest and authority. You'll find that in 99.9% of the cases, the people that espouse this doctrine have no training in Hebrew or Aramaic or Greek or theology or linguistics or history or any of the humanities. They've got no training. And so it becomes they haven't put in the hours and months and years in many cases that it takes to develop conversancy in these subjects and in the languages.
Yeah.
And that's dangerous. I mean, it's of course I want to promote interest. Of course we as disciples of Christ want to promote interest because that's part of the discipleship process.
Right.
But at the same time, it's dangerous that this idea has been espoused so widely by a lot of people who claim to have done research on this, but they have not, again, put in the work, the time to understand the nuance and the mechanics of the passages and languages that they're studying.
Yeah.
Well, I would think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Judd, that someone who's put time into Hebrew is a lot different than somebody like, say, me, who has a cursory knowledge of Hebrew. I took Greek in seminary, but I didn't take Hebrew, so I have a cursory knowledge in Hebrew. I know how to use the lexicons and stuff like that. That's good, but for what you're talking about, to really draw out nuance, that would take someone who has been fluent in Hebrew for decades to be able to draw a nuance.
But here's the thing, though, that even with the tools at hand, and they are expansive in this day and age, we've got all kinds of free online, really good, in some cases, to the point of being scholastically critically good resources that can be applied to these problematic passages.
Yeah.
So in that respect, if those resources are engaged enough, the commentaries and word studies and things like that, even utilizing those, a person should be able to reason what the passage is talking about, that it's not talking about, this fabricated sexual liaison that supposedly takes place between the serpent and Eve and the product being Cain. I find it interesting as a historian that really this issue was put to rest by the church fathers.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in particular, I'm thinking of Irenaeus, writing in the 2nd century, wrote a work called Against Heresies, in which he basically dispels this idea that had been circulating in the early church. Interestingly enough, Gnostic influences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Ophites, I think, were one of the ones that held to that. I'm saying their name right.
Yeah, from Ophia, the Greek word for serpent. And for people who are even passingly knowledgeable about the history of Gnosticism, the serpent represents the sort of knowledge dichotomy that existed in Gnostic theology, where everything in the Old Testament was demonized. The theology in the Old Testament was basically demonized, and the God of the Old Testament that they called Yaldabaoth was actually an evil, insane God, and that it was the serpent that was bringing wisdom. 9 times out of 10, these theological issues that still crop up today, a lot of the literature, the patristic literature that the church fathers turned out, solves a lot of these problems. Why? Because they were dealing with it almost on a day-to-day basis, because it was such an ensconced part of the late antique Greco-Roman culture and the early church, that these were things that had to be addressed quickly, or they became problematic for church communities. And they did in the varieties of Christianity that we find throughout the Mediterranean basin. And so I would just like to, right off the bat, just reiterate that you really have to look no further than Irenaeus to solve whether this is balderdash or not. On my platforms, I've started almost every week, I give out a little award that I call the Flaming Bullfeather Award. And the serpent seed was maybe my first or second.
Oh, was it? I didn't see that one.
Yeah.
I've been following them.
Well, I've either put it out or I've got it in the queue, but it certainly deserves a Flaming Bullfeather Award if I have not given it one yet, because it's such an unsound idea. Although you find these kernels of early Gnostic ideology laying the groundwork for it. Another thing that's interesting to me that I've observed is that people that espouse and propound the serpent seed doctrine are relying in many cases on literature that was produced after the writing of certainly the Old Testament, but the Gospels too. And I've already referenced the Gnostic influence. A lot of the early serpent seed doctrine was sort of distilled in one of the Gnostic Gospels, the Gospel of Philip, that again circulated in parts of the Mediterranean basin during the early Christian period. But again, we're talking about literature that's, in the Gnostic literature, in the context of Gnostic literature, certainly at least a century or two after. And then there's also Jewish literature that's consulted, and I'm thinking of Targum and Midrash material that in all cases are, we're talking, this is medieval literature that's written after 800 or 900 AD. And the probably the most notorious one is the Zohar, which is an extremely obtuse, in some cases, I suppose might be the right word, but certainly peripheral mystical document that sort of props up the serpent seed doctrine. But again, this is people that use this literature as justification for interpreting Genesis 3 as giving us the serpent seed doctrine are doing so on pretty dubious, shaky ground by using literature that's written so much after the fact. Used in some cases ritual magic. The Zohar is a central text for the Kabbalah.
Yeah, that's what I was about to ask. Yeah.
So that's why I say that it's a dangerous heretical idea to be espousing, but it gets lots of clicks on your social media platforms. You don't have to go very far into the YouTube world or Instagram or TikTok or what have you, and you're going to run into people espousing the serpent seed doctrine.
Yeah, I think where I first heard it briefly, one of the first times was through a pretty famous pastor, Arnold Murray, out of
Arnold Murray,
Arkansas.
Shepherd's Chapel,
Yeah, and I'm sure it obviously came before him, but I think he was one of the more modern espousers of it. And what's so, to me, dangerous, like you say, because it is, I think he had a lot of other aberrant doctrines as well, but he had a lot of things correct, and he seemed like just an old Bible preacher from Arkansas, and had to trust. There's people that still follow him now, and he's dead. And I think about, I read a biography about a Pentecostal guy, William Branham. I think he got to where he established or taught that doctrine towards the end of his life as well.
Yeah, both Murray and Branhamism, which were espoused in certain Pentecostal and even primitive Baptist and a few other denominations, not universally, but in niches. They were espoused.
Daniel Parker for the Primitive Baptists, I believe.
Right.
Yeah.
And even cult figures like Sun and Moon also espoused the serpent seed doctrine. And disturbingly, there were, I mean, if it's not disturbing enough, if it's not rattling your cages already, it was an idea that was espoused by several white supremacist movements in America in the 20th century, not the least of which were the American Nazi Party and the Ku Klux Klan. Because it became, just like it had been used by people, espousing slavery, it became an easy tool. That is the serpent seed interpretation became an easy tool to demonize certain groups, and it had been used for that purpose in centuries before, but in just justifying chattel slavery and the supremacy of one ethnic group over another. Despite the doctrine itself being erroneous, it has a very checkered past in terms of its utilization by certain groups for rather unseemly and unethical things.
Sadly, it seemed like Branham was the least wacky person who believed it. I would
that's bizarre. Well, Dr. Judd, I think it's interesting too that we talk about, and this is something else that really bothers me too on the other end. Word heretic and heresy is thrown around like candy, and everybody's a heretic. If you different groups of different denominations will throw heresy at the other one,
Mhm.
stuff like that. So that's a thing nowadays too, the whole dialectic. But it's interesting to me that this, according to what you just said, it not only was a doctrine that was just a doctrine, which I would think all doctrines lead this way, but this doctrine actually led to a change of lifestyle in life. I mean, it actually led to a fruit that was destructive and rotten.
Mhm.
And most of it does, but it's really blatantly obvious with this one to me.
Yeah, and that's a good litmus test for sound doctrine is what fruits is it producing?
Mm-hmm.
If they're fruits of the expansion of knowledge and discipleship and charity and forbearance, those are the kind of hallmarks that that the writers of the New Testament are constantly drumming on about, right? The fruits of the faith.
Yeah.
So that right there, that should be the first and the last test for sound doctrine. And the epiphenomenon of discussion of doctrine is why we have denominations in the first place. And I'm here to tell you that none of us have the complete picture. At the end of the day, I like what my buddy Doug Van Dort says. At the end of the day, we all have bad theology.
Yes. Amen. Amen. I shouldn't celebrate that, but I think I should celebrate that we're all imperfect.
Well, and one thing I was telling a fellow recently is, hey, look, when we come face to face with Jesus, he's not going to be checking our denomination card.
Yeah,
he's going to be asking, "Did you know me? And what were those fruits of your faith?" So, but this becomes the kind of laboratory for testing heretical thought, and it should be implicit even in our discipleship training, that this is how you go about testing what is heretical and what is not, what is Christ-like and what is not. And the serpent seed doctrine just fails the test horrendously. And again, I'm one in a long line of people who have brought criticism and indeed dismissal. In a lot of cases, I defer to the late Dr. Mike Heiser, who was a good friend of mine, and he wrote on this subject a number of times. In fact, you can still go to his websites and find articles that outline the mechanics of why this is such a bad piece of doctrinal hermeneutics. But again, it's flashy. It gets those clicks, and that's sort of the temptation of social media. Not that it's inherently a bad thing, but that's one of the trends that I've noticed is that it does, for people that espouse it, it does generate a lot of views on content.
Yeah. I mean, there are sensational shows and things and stuff out there, YouTube channels, all kinds of stuff, and that's what they're there to do. I think they could do it probably like some of the ones that are more fiction and get the same response, however.
Mhm.
But I kind of want to, if it's all right with you, just circle back around and Lindsay had suggested this earlier before you got on the show that he thought this would be a good place to really clear up some area.
Mhm.
So why do you think fringe or liminal? We'll just stick with fringe. Why do you think fringe circles confuse the whole Nephilim narrative of the seed war with the serpent seed doctrine? Do you see that a lot? I see it a lot. I just didn't know if you saw it. Quite a bit.
Well, yeah,
as well.
it's prolific. It's prolific again because it's convenient. There's some more of that linguistic pareidolia or contextual pareidolia that's going on. It makes sense to me. Ergo, it must be true. That's faulty reasoning, and I get it. I mean, we're in this space where we espouse the supernatural and the strange because it's in the Bible. I mean, the Bible presents a supernatural worldview. We're not denying any of that. We embrace it. But just as, again, if I can defer to writers of the New Testament, not one of them encourages us to abandon our reason while embracing the supernatural. Not one of them. I challenge anybody to find me a passage where that is the case. You're not going to find it.
No, it's a both and. It's not either or.
It's a both and, exactly.
I know that's cliche, but it's still true.
It makes it nonetheless true.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing that I'm always trying to instill on my students and on, the interviews and podcasts, things like that I do, is that, embrace the supernatural, but it doesn't mean that you abandon reason and logic, because that's something that's taught to us in the New Testament, and certainly in the patristic literature. A lot of these guys were, before they came to the faith, they were products of the same academies that their philosopher counterparts were, and so they understood the value of logic and reason.
Yeah,
and so it's an easy leap to go from the serpent seed doctrine to the creation and the sustaining of the Nephilim line, because it seems like, in my estimation, because of what happens in Genesis 6, and as what's explicated and further expanded on in the apocryphal stuff like Enoch and Jubilees and the Genesis Apocrypha and in the Dead Sea Scroll material in general, it's easy to project what happened there, which actually was carnal. In other words, you have angels mating with humans,
right,
and project that onto the serpent seed doctrine. And I've also seen influencers and social media gurus talk about when Jesus in the New Testament is addressing the Pharisees. A couple of times he calls them a brood of vipers. That this is the end all be all evidence that these Pharisees were the part of this wicked line that began with Cain. But there's no justification in that. And in fact, again, the trend amazes me of how much it's used to lure people in to watch videos and listen to content and stuff like that. And that to me seems very demonic. It seems very satanic.
Yeah.
There's clear demonic influence there. And that illustrates another danger here, is that you're not just, people that espouse this are not in propounding it, are not just espousing erroneous doctrine, but they're disseminating it at the behest of this demonic influence.
Yeah. Judd, how would you respond to this appeal to hidden knowledge? This was hidden, and we discovered it, kind of thing. You often, not just with this doctrine, but similar doctrines or any sort of Gnostic tinged doctrine like this. How would you respond to that? Well,
the allure of the power inherent in knowledge is as old as time. And that's the whole MO for the occult in general, is this secret knowledge.
Yeah.
That'll give you some sort of spiritual edge over everybody else, or fill in the blank, whatever aspirations a person has that they're trying to attain. But it's a lie, just like it was a lie from the mouth of the serpent to Eve. But what are the things that the Nakash offered to Adam and Eve? Surely you won't die. You eat this, you're going to be like gods. You'll have ultimate knowledge. Well, they already had all that. At that stage, they had all that. They communed directly with God. They had the ultimate source of knowledge, the ultimate search engine. It went beyond anything, any AI that man could drum up to answer our questions, went astronomically beyond that. They had everything that the serpent was supposedly offering to them.
They had access to the source of knowledge.
Yeah. Wisdom himself.
That's right. Knowledge tempered with wisdom.
Well, when we were going over this stuff, I was hit with a thought. And this might be, you'll have to check my logic here, Dr. Judd, but would if the serpent seed of Cain is true, why would the enemy have a need to do Genesis 6?
Mhm.
Is that flawed logic, or is
Well,
that a
no,
good
no, no,
question?
no. That's not flawed logic, because ultimately the denizens that the followers of Christ have to go up against are demonic and demonically influenced individuals.
So it seems like to me it would be like, well, I can affect the whole human race, or I can wait several years later and just affect the partial part of the race.
Mhm, mhm.
I mean, I know God's sovereignty is involved in all this.
Right.
It just seems like, even from a satanic or occultic purpose of his plan, if he had Adam create Cain and Cain permeated the earth, then
Mhm.
his plan was achieved. And I don't even know sometimes, and you'll have to correct me about this, I don't even know if it was like a plan of one being for this whole. I mean, is there really one
Mm.
angel that is like the head godfather that plans all this, or do they operate kind of as a committee, maybe too, as the false divine council, and they?
Well, yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, is that it seems to be that on some things they're of an accord, and on others they're not, because they're
Interesting.
all self-serving and self-interested,
Yeah,
and
Yeah.
they're all playing this game against really against the fulfillment of the fullness of the Gentiles. Whenever that clock runs out, whatever that looks like to God is how much time they have, and they're sort of playing this. They're trying to play towards a stalemate game, if I could use a chess analogy, but that's not going to be
Yeah.
possible. But
Yeah.
that's really the only victory that you know that they can have, is basically take as many people
Yeah.
away as they possibly can.
Yeah. Kind of like a. I mean, this is maybe a bad comparison, but
Mhm.
like a suicide bomber. Their goal is not to win. Their goal is to take out and
Yeah,
further
yeah,
their cause. So yeah.
very similar, very similar. But again, we're talking about I mean, these are largely spiritual, philosophical, and moral issues that a lot of serpent seed espousers seem to. And I'll be the first one to admit that Genesis 3:15 is it's a multi-layered prophecy.
hmm
As most prophecy is.
Yeah.
It's fulfilled and hits not just in a single point in space and time, but has ramifications for past, present, and future. By way of example, the portion of the Genesis 3:15 prophecy that talks about Jesus crushing the head of the serpent. Well,
Yeah.
one way that that's fulfilled is that he literally does that with almost every step of his ministry.
Mm.
Much of it is in Galilee and Upper Galilee, the eastern portions of which were ancient Bashan, which was quite literally in Phoenician, the land of the serpent. And so with every step that he's taking, he's literally crushing the serpent. And even more so when he's at Caesarea Philippi, because that's smack dab in ancient Bashan. And there's a valley that runs on the western side of Mount Hermon, called the Beth Rahab Valley, which is probably the oldest name for Peneus, Beth Rahab. Rahab in Hebrew can mean cursed. It can also mean, it's also another name for Leviathan
Mhm.
in the Old Testament, which of course is the great ringing serpent. So again, Jesus is quite literally crushing the head of the serpent, at Caesarea Philippi at Peneus during that episode in Matthew 16 and Mark chapter 8.
Mm.
Those are directions that you could take when looking at the verse in a verse like Genesis 3:15, and then applying it to its fulfillment in prophecy by using historical context.
Yeah.
Which, again, not to say that people that espouse these kinds of erroneous ideas aren't familiar with concepts like historiography and context, but they're clearly not done the work to properly use them, or else they would not come to a conclusion like the serpent seed doctrine.
Yeah. And two, and I think it's like you talked about at the beginning. There's this
Mhm.
textual pareidolia, like the word seed. They read the seed. If you don't read it in its context, in Abraham's seed, we are Abraham's seed, but I am not of Semitic line
Right.
or Aramean or whatever he was.
Right.
So I'm his seed, though, because of Christ. And so that same, I guess, poetic or metaphor would work for this seed will stomp this seed. It doesn't have to necessarily be DNA, but we live in a society where we want to make it literal, and I get that because they're finding a lot of really cool stuff about DNA and in science. We don't want to read into that text with isogesis that seed is always sexual or biological or that, and that's what jumps out at me at is that 315, like you just said, it has multiple layers of meaning.
Yeah, you've hit on one of the basic problems, and that's isogetical, the isogesis rather than exegetical. For listeners, eisegesis is the projection of in more cases than not, a biased hermeneutic onto the text rather than letting the text speak for itself and reading it in the ancient context and in terms of author and audience.
Which was, correct me if I'm wrong, which was also a big hermeneutical method of Gnostics, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thinking back to my own training as a historian.
Yes, sir.
One of the first upper division classes I took was a medieval history class. And I think that same semester I took historiography. And historiography is for your listeners, historiography is twofold. It's one, it's the process of doing history, the research and the writing of history. And secondly, it's the history of the field itself, how it progressed.
Yeah. Why they wrote it the way they did.
Yeah, exactly. And so what I'm getting at is sort of the first historiographical rule that I learned was to avoid something called presentism. Presentism is like you can think of it as historical eisegesis. It's the projection of your cultural norms onto a past narrative, automatically, reading it out of context. And so this was one of those cardinal rules in historiography that you weren't supposed to break. And of course, when I took theology classes, in church history and stuff like that, and the seminary that was on campus, learned that this is basically the same thing as eisegesis in a historical context. And that's what's you point out accurately, that's what's happening with the text for people who espouse the serpent seed doctrine. Big no-no.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people.
It's easy to do. I mean, just it's our natural reaction to look at things that happened in the past and say, "Oh, well, I can't believe they did that. Why in the world would they do that?" If somebody dropped us off into, England 1,000 years ago, they might as well be dropping us off on another planet.
Exactly.
Our customs and manners would be different. We would not be able to communicate with them. Maybe 5% of what we say might filter through. But people in England at the time were speaking Anglo-Saxon. So that's an example of what we're talking about here, is that we approaching past narratives and evidence from the past, and in this case, biblical text and doctrine. We always need to approach it cautiously and with as much of an eye towards its historical context, its cultural context as we possibly can.
Yeah, one of my pet peeves about that, if this is what historiography is what I call chronological snobbery. How we think that we're smarter because we have more technology and more blah, 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 when we don't even realize probably what was in the Library of Alexandria. They got burned up or whatever.
Certainly. Well, and even with when I used to give when I gave historiography seminars to undergraduates, even with in particular with ancient documents and ancient history and inscriptions and archaeological evidence, the farther back you go, typically the less you have to work with. You've got a lot of fragmentary stuff. Mm-hmm. We're blessed in the case of the Bible that we actually have more evidence, more copies of that than we do of Homeric literature in the ancient world, which again, to me, speaks to God's providence in letting us have all of this stuff. But as a rule of thumb, you typically have fragmentary evidence that you're working with in the past. And so your interpretation needs to be very measured, very cautious. And that, I think to a degree, that should be true of us when we read the Bible, or rather when we study the Bible.
Yeah.
So that we're less apt to stumble like that. Again, not to say that the Holy Spirit, the Paraclete, isn't our best source of commentary, but again, there's that faith married to reason. Let's take into account context. Let's take into account what the author was saying. Let's take into account what the audience knew that we might not know today, that might cause an author to not mention something because it was implicit, it was widely known. All of these are, and many more, are factors that should register, when approaching, in this case, a biblical text, but really any ancient text or ancient source of knowledge or piece of evidence. Again, to intone Paul, we're looking through a glass darkly. This stuff is all going to be revealed to us totally, ultimately one day, but for now, we see through a glass darkly.
Yeah.
That's why people like Doug Van Dorn very wisely say that at the end of the day, we have bad theology. We have an incomplete picture. And so we need to remember that when we're developing and using hermeneutics. We need to take a very measured approach to Scripture, because that ultimately, combined with our prayerful hopes, is the best way to deliver sound doctrine.
Yeah. Well, let me go. We're about to run out of time, wrapping up our time, but there's one other question I kind of want to go rabbit trail that relates to this, and we can bring it back to this, is what other areas in our fringe or liminal space do you see that are Gnostic, or do you see a Gnostic trend in even evangelicalism and all that nowadays? Do you see that?
Yes. I mean, in certain circles, I don't know how familiar you guys are with the Emergent church movement.
Yeah, Brian McLaren and all those
yeah.
guys. Oh,
I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's one of the things that occurs to me. Now, I sort of saw the seedling of this movement up close and personal. I did my undergraduate work at Hardin-Simmons University in Abilene, Texas, and there were a number of people that would become prominent in the Emergent church movement that I was literally taking classes with. In fact, I won't name names. I won't need to. But one of them actually took Greek with me for a while. He washed out, but that may have been part of his problem. The individual I'm thinking of was involved in a praise and it was labeled a kind of praise and worship service, and I mean everybody was telling me about it. This would have been about 97, 98. And I went once, and it sounded like woo-woo to me before. I went, but when I went and saw that this fellow that I'm thinking about was involved in it, it completely turned me off. Like there was something, in my discernment barometer that went off. Like there something odd, elevating of the spirit of, over sound doctrine seemed to me to be a current in the very initial stages of what became known as the Emergent church movement.
Yeah.
And it
Progressive Trojan horse.
Yes,
progress.
That's exactly what occurred to me, is that it was postmodernized Christianity. And on an intellectual level, postmodernism turned me off because of its jettisoning of objective truth. And when I saw, the Emergent church movement was not the only one to embrace this, but that's what it seems like on the surface, is that they were pursuing the sort of knowledge beyond what was already presented in the gospel, and that our interpretation, our Southern Baptist interpretation of the gospel or whatever was not sound enough. So many red flags that were going up about it.
Yeah. Well, it's been rebranded now. It's called Deconstruction.
Yeah.
And let me caveat it. Not all deconstruction is bad, because I've been through some, and
certainly,
believing in the divine council worldview was a act of deconstruction for me in a lot of ways. Yeah, it really did. So I don't want to paint with that too broad of a brush, but it's like Lindsay said, it's that progressive Trojan horse. You know, I mean,
That's
Brian
it.
McLaren now is a liberal Episcopal priest.
Mm-hmm.
He married his son to another guy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's facts. I'm not besmirching his reputation. That's just
Right,
you can read,
right.
Google it, and that's where that ended up, and that's where I think Gnosticism always tends to end up for some reason.
No, I tend to agree. Yeah, because these guys were pursuing, again, knowledge outside of the bounds of prescribed in Scripture.
Never
And
thought of it like that.
that's always a bad recipe, and that's at the heart of not just ancient Gnosticism but modern Gnosticism.
Yeah,
It's how things like the Sophia doctrine crept its way into certain Christian denominations. When I make reference to denominations, again, Jesus is not going to be checking our denomination card. There are certain things that all of us, regardless of our denomination, whether we're charismatic or Baptist or Pentecostal or Orthodox or Roman Catholic, it just, there's certain things that we have to come to the table and agree with, that we're creedal about, that go far beyond the denominational ties.
I like how Bart said it.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. I know he was kind of tongue in cheek with that, but if we have the right creedal, like you said, foundation, then we will love the real Jesus, not some artificial one.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and you're not accidentally pagan, but there's a difference between that sort of ecumenicism and embracing bad doctrine.
Yes.
The former is what we want. The latter is what we want to dispel and point people away from.
Yeah.
And again, we're on your podcast right now. We're talking about this stuff. It's interesting stuff to talk about because it does venture into this liminal phase, but it circles back to also the centrality and the importance of sound doctrine.
Yes.
I think we can unequivocally say that the serpent seed is bad doctrine on not just theological grounds, but linguistic grounds and historical grounds.
Yeah. Well, but let me ask you this. I wouldn't go as far, and I have a hard time even dealing this out like the early church did anyway, but I wouldn't go so far as to say if somebody held this certain belief, maybe just this belief, that they're anathema or a full-blown heretic or anything like that. But usually with this doctrine comes anti-Trinitarianism and a lot of other problems with your Christology stuff, and all that.
Yeah,
but if somebody
it doesn't lead to a deconstruction that can be a good thing, but it leads to a complete unraveling in some cases.
Good word. It's a really good word. Yep. And that's what we don't want. And if your faith unravels, I've watched it happen. I mean, you had a big guy in that Tony Campolo, his son. Like I said, this is just facts. I'm not naming names, but this is just a fact. His son is now a full blown atheist, and that's a fruit of that unraveling, so to speak. Because I think he was on the tail end of that whole Emergent church, and then I think they tried to distinguish between the two, calling one emerging and then the other one emergent. And anyway, semantics and stuff. But yeah. I was actually attracted to that, like at first, because of the whole. Hey, yeah, let's look at how to do church different. I mean, it's obvious that we're not doing church probably the best way we can. So let's look at different, but it went far, like you said, it went far beyond just praxis. It went into doctrinal. It was incorrect doctrine is not good. And I'm like this. I believe in the wideness of God's mercy. I don't want to judge people's heart. And all this stuff came out about Ozzy. And I was like, Mark's safe from not judging Ozzy's heart today. And
exactly.
But
God's grace is broad, and it's broad in ways that we can't completely fathom. And that's even evident in the Old Testament under the law, because even the law wasn't enough. That's another trend today is, so, well, you, in addition to being a Christian, you have to hold up the Torah.
Torahs,
And the Torah is instructed to us. Of course, it's instructive to us today. But, go read Galatians.
Or Hebrews.
Or Hebrew. Yeah, exactly. What I was pointing towards was that God's grace was necessary in the Old Testament too, because the law was, just as it is today, was instructive, but it was not enough because nobody could keep it. You look at the Old Testament, it's a story of what? Screw up after screw up.
Yeah, you're right.
After screw up after screw up. And that is the trajectory of salvation, is we can't do it on our own.
Boom. That's the gospel. Yeah. That's the good news.
That's the good news, right? Is that you can be part of Abraham's family.
Yeah.
And
why do people want to go back to that?
Yeah. I know.
Is it a novelty thing? I think I liken it to this, and I'm an Anglican priest, but I'm retired. I went through this spell of, and it wasn't all this. There was some theological stuff too, but this whole like smells and bells and stoles and candles and all that stuff, which I love. It's beautiful. It's great. It's part of the church history. It's part of tradition and all that stuff. But I think sometimes people are attracted to the exterior of it, not really looking into the interior of what we're talking about. And most of it's the same. That's what cracks me up when I get on Facebook and people are bickering over some of the stupidest stuff. And I'm like, there's a lot of this is semantics. And anyway, so I don't know what made me chase that rabbit, kill that one. But
it's Mike Heiser used to say the New Testament should point Christians to the Old Testament, and the Old Testament should point Jews to the New Testament. Something along those lines. And so, of course, it's still relevant. Of course, it's fulfillment. It's a biblical prophecy. It's almost impossible to understand the return of Christ if you don't understand the biblical feast.
Yeah.
So, and that's just one of many examples. So, of course, but to be tied to it beyond grace is just not part. It's not part of the new covenant.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong here. The Hebrew connotation of the word Torah, we use law, and it was a law, but it was more than a law. It was more of an instruction, right? I mean, wouldn't that be a better word for it?
Well,
like the teaching.
It's implicit in the definition of law, and I think this is part of Western tradition, because that's where it begins. And the ancient Levant is the laws are not just, they're not just a structure, that they're meant to be living and breathing. And that's why I say that implicit in the use of the word, the translation of the word law, is that of course it's instructive, in an analogous way, in the ways that our own laws in the United States are supposed to be instructive. Well, they're supposed to be instructive. I don't know that they always are, but
and one side says it's supposed to be new and living. They mean completely abolish the Constitution and invent something new.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, but liberals do that with the Bible as well.
They do.
It doesn't. It's not the word. It contains the word, and we get to tell you where the word is and where it's not.
Yeah, this is a whole other podcast episode.
Yeah, exactly. But, well, Dr. Judd, is there anything else? This has been brilliant. I love just talking to you about this kind of stuff. And I still want to ask somebody that believes in the serpent seed why Genesis 6 happened, if it happened. Now, I'm going to find somebody, and very nicely, if that's possible, ask somebody that. I just curious. To me, it was just like, it's like it almost appeared out of thin air.
Very much so.
Yeah, but thank you so much for coming on our show and sharing and dropping the knowledge. That's what the other boys say, so I love them too. So dropping us some knowledge, so we appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Judd.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening and supporting us. And remember, stay naturally supernatural.